Okay, so I want to start out by talking about an oversimplification. This is a theory that was first advanced, I think, in the late 19th century as a way of trying to explain an important transition that happens in ancient Greece. Okay, first of all, you have a way of thinking that's exemplified by the Greek myths and by mythology in most places. And so, the word that we use to describe that is mythos. Um, Mythos, which just means sort of a mythological understanding of the world that explains natural phenomena and basically human emotions, everything that's happening in terms of the action of a god or another. A really great example of this would be the beginning of most classical literature, where Homer or Hesiod or whoever it is invokes the muse, and they say, oh muse, sing through me. In other words, they're asking this question, like, how can I be so creative? How can I come up with all these words that I'm saying right now? How can I create? And the answer is, I'm not doing it. It's a God doing it, and the God's taking over me, right? If you think about the Greek gods, you've got the god Ares. Ares is all about violence and rage and anger. And when Ares takes you over, you're angry, you're mad, you want to kill somebody, and that's what he likes. Think about Eros or Aphrodite, the goddess of love. When she's in charge, when she's working through you, you kind of want to get romantic, if you know what I'm talking about. Okay, so what about Athena? Athena is the goddess of wisdom and strategy, and she has to do with war. That's true. But she also has to do with wisdom, right, and knowledge and study. And then, you've got Dionysius or Bacchus, right? The god of wine. What he wants to do, what he wants you to do is to party. If you drink too much and you start acting crazy, it's not you, it's a god that did it. Right? And as a college student, you should really think about this, because if there are multiple gods, if there really is an Ares and an Aphrodite and a Dionysius and an Athena, you can't do all the things that they want you to do at the same time. Athena wants you to study, which I would endorse. Dionysius wants you to party, but you can't do both at the same time. I've tried, and it doesn't work. Eros or Aphrodite wants you to, basically get it on, right? Now, you can party and, get it on. Fine. But can you study and get it on? I tried the study date kind of thing in college, and it usually turned out being one thing or the other. And mostly, study was not what I was interested in at that time. Okay, so what about Ares? Ares wants you to fight. You can drink and party and fight, sure. Can you drink, party, study? Can you get, romantic and get violent at the same time? Well, they put you in prison for that kind of thing. When the gods take over you, fundamentally, the most important thing is you are not unified. You're not one thing. You're acting on behalf of a multitude of different forces. There was a movie that came out a while ago, which I haven't seen because my kids didn't want to. It's a kid's movie where inside a young girl's mind, her different emotions are personified by these little homunculi, by little people. And each one of them has their own personality and their own things that they're trying to do. And sometimes they're in control, and sometimes they're not in control. And when they're not in control, they're mad and they want to get in control. Is that the way we are? And is that the way we have to be? Right? The mythos way of thinking about the world explains nature, it explains our origins, it explains our emotions in terms of the actions of God. And the number one thing you have to understand about a mythological way of thinking about the world is that the world doesn't really, on that way of thinking, make sense. The world is not rational. Okay, so starting around the 4th century BC, there's a new train of thought. Again, this is an oversimplification because it was always there. But in some ways, it becomes stronger. And I think when you look at modern times, you see in many ways the triumph of this way of thinking. And maybe it's going away now. Maybe it was a mistake. That is called logos, right? And logos can mean law, but in this case, what it really means is logic, reason. Okay, when you appeal to logos, what you're trying to do is make sense of the world. You're trying to say there's one explanation that all the other things reduce to. Okay, so one of the first people to advance this train of thought in early classical times was a fellow named Thales. Okay, so Thales was kind of your classic absent-minded professor. Okay, Thales. He lived in Miletus, which is in what's now Turkey in the Middle East, but it was part of the Greek world at the time. So Thales, we know exactly one thing that Thales said, one statement, and this comes from there are other things attributed to him by Aristotle, but the one like that we're pretty sure that Thales said, the number one thing that he believed, right, was this claim. Well, look, I'm going to tell you that in a second. I'll tell you the story about Thales first. Okay, so Thales was like this absent-minded professor. Like one night he's walking around looking at the stars, and he was fascinated with astronomy. The Egyptians had invented astronomy, and he had learned some of this, the mysteries. They could predict the weather, all this kind of stuff by looking at the stars. They know when the flood was coming. It gave them some kind of knowledge that he was really craving after, right? So he's wandering around at night, looking up at the stars, and he falls down a well. I mean, come on. And so everybody, they pull him out of the well and they say, Thales, you're so impractical. Get your head out of the clouds, man. Do something practical with your life. You guys are useless, right? And so Thales decides to prove them wrong. So he studies the stars, he studies the heavens, and he predicts rain. He predicts a rainy season. There had been a drought in Asia Minor for many years, and the olives, which were their main crop for export, their main cash crop, the olive harvest had been really, really bad, right? And so what Thales does is he goes around and he buys all the olive presses, and people are like, oh, Thales, this is exactly the wrong, look, it doesn't rain anymore. You don't need an olive press because there's no olives. And he says, oh, I guess I'm just, absent-minded professor. Oops. And so he predicts this rainy season. It does rain, and then when there's a bumper crop of olives, everybody thinks, man, we're going to make a fortune with this olive oil. Where's the olive press? And then, somebody has to point out, oh, Thales bought it. And so what he does is he rents the olive presses back to them, makes a fortune, and everyone, says, Thales, actually, maybe you're not so stupid after all. Thales was fascinated with the weather. He was fascinated with transformations in nature. And so he decided that it wasn't really the action of multiple gods doing various different things all the different time, completely without any coordination from each other. He decides, very simply, it all comes down to one thing. Everything, he says, is made of... Okay, he says water. Okay, now that's not true. Not everything is made of water. But most importantly, water is not made of water. And whenever someone tells you everything is made of such and such, you should ask them what that's made of. If someone tells you everything's made of atoms, you got to ask what are atoms made of. Now, maybe they'll say atoms are irreducible, right? In which case, you need to figure out how many different kinds of atoms there are. And then this is the way science has proceeded over the last few centuries. So Thales says everything is made of water, which is not true, but probably, he was thinking about the sorts of transformations you see in nature, right? Where you get ice that melts into liquid, rocks turn into water. If you heat it up, water turns into air and disappears. Then, the clouds form and air turns into water. And so those transformations, the phase changes he thought maybe were a way to explain the nature of everything. And it doesn't matter what the theory was, whether everything is water or everything isn't water. What matters is that this part, everything is blank. Right? Once you start making a theory where you're saying that everything is one thing, you've entered the realm of logos and reason. You've entered a world where, when you're trying to say why something happened, your explanation might itself require a subsidiary explanation, which would then have another explanation, but ultimately, when you get to the bottom of it, that's where you are. Think of chemistry, right? When you look at the kinds of ways that materials behave, Often they behave the way they do because of the things that they're made of. Why does salt dissolve in water? Well, because salt isn't salt. Salt's sodium and chloride, and they're both ions, and the ions dissolve into water, right? Okay, why does salt dissolve into water? Why does sodium and chlorine form ions? Well, it's because of the neutrons, protons, and mostly electrons that are in the that form those different atoms, right? So sodium is unstable. It tends to want to push toward a positive sort of cation and lose an electron. Chlorine is looking to gain electrons. It has kind of a negative sort of ionic charge, and that's just because of the instability of the electron orbitals, right? And that so then you're explaining salt dissolving in water, right? But beneath that, the reason why salt dissolves in water is because of what salt's made of. And the reason why sodium and chlorine behave the way they do is what they're made of, which is electrons, neutrons, and protons. Maybe that's rock bottom. If everything is electrons, neutrons, and protons, then that means that you can explain uranium, and you can explain rust, and you can explain electricity, and you can explain magnetism, and all of those different phenomena in terms of electrons, protons, and neutrons, right? That would be a reductionism down to a single principle, or reduction. Let's not say reductionism. It would be a reduction to a single principle, right? Everything is X. Everything is subatomic particles. All right, that's logos. Think of the difference. If you're trying to explain human behavior, like someone like Sigmund Freud, right, he would reduce down to a bunch of very simple principles. The drive for sex, right, the drive for survival. Those different things together explain a lot of human behavior. You don't need a god to do it. Why does it rain? Is it Zeus pissing through a sieve? You don't need to explain that because you can talk about natural transformations, which is simpler, right? Logos shoots for a simpler, reduced explanation. And that's the beginning of philosophy. Philosophy begins in an attempt to make sense of the world in a simple way, in a unified way, and in a rational way. So that's mythos and a logos. Thank you.